Good day. Today is Saturday, 28th June 2025. And again, before returning to the perennial topic of these programs, the conflict in Ukraine, I'm going to discuss the situation in the Middle East, the conflict between Israel and Iran, and between Iran and the United States. I'm going to do that because there's been some important developments, and in my opinion, they relate very closely to the two issues: whether Iran might decide to acquire nuclear weapons. I don't think a decision of that kind has yet been made in Iran, but I'm starting to sense that perhaps we are indeed beginning to move in that direction. But perhaps more importantly and more pressingly, the state of relations between Iran and the United States. Now, yesterday, reports began to circulate that there were discussions within the United States about the Trump administration providing a offer to Iran of a $30 billion program to enable Iran to develop a civil nuclear industry if Iran in return were to agree to scrap the entirety of its nuclear enrichment program. In other words, if Iran were to give up its right to enrich uranium at all, not even enrich uranium to the level of 3.7%, which it is universally accepted is a level consistent with the civilian and peaceful use of enriched uranium. Well, I said in my program yesterday that that proposal, if it existed, was very, very similar to a proposal that the United States made to North Korea in the 1990s. In that proposal, the United States, that was the time the Clinton administration, suggested to North Korea that North Korea dismantle its entire nuclear program, its various nuclear facilities in North Korea, give up any effort to develop a nuclear weapon, and in return the United States would provide North Korea with sanctions relief, moving towards full normalization of relations between North Korea and the United States, and would also provide North Korea with pressurized water nuclear reactors to enable North Korea to develop peacefully and with the support of the IAEA and the international community, a civilian nuclear energy program. And North Korea accepted the deal, and there was an agreement, an actual formal agreement between North Korea and the United States. And as I remember, North Korea moved forward to implement its various provisions. They started dismantling many of the facilities, the nuclear facilities that they had built, and disposing of some of their nuclear fuel. And it looked for a time as if the issue of North Korea's nuclear weapons program had been solved. Well, then all the usual things that happen when countries try to negotiate these sort of deals with the United States began to surface, because, as is so often the case with the United States, a deal which is agreed is treated in the United States not as the end point of a complex negotiation, but rather as the starting point of a further, even more complex negotiation. You see that you've seen this with the JCPOA that took 13 years to negotiate between Iran, the United States, and various other countries, and appeared to have come to a conclusive decision about the status of Iran's nuclear enrichment program. and which was agreed between Iran and the United States and other countries back in 2015. And you can see that with the Minsk agreement, which was negotiated by the Russians with the Ukrainians and various Western countries, Germany and France, and which the United States and Britain publicly endorsed and voted for in the UN Security Council. And you see exactly the same thing with this deal that the United States negotiated with North Korea back in the 1990s. No sooner was the ink on this deal dry than the various critics of the deal in the United States started to mobilize. They said that it didn't go anywhere near far enough. They said that it made unacceptable concessions to the North Koreans. They did everything they possibly could to sabotage the deal. And in effect, the United States defaulted on its key obligations under the deal. And then when Bill Clinton ceased to be president and was replaced by George W. Bush, the United States went back on the deal in its entirety and declared North Korea to be a member of the Axis of Evil, the so-called Axis of Evil, and therefore a country ripe for regime change. So the North Koreans at that point made the obvious decision that they were being targeted by the United States. And of course, the sequel, which I will come to later in this program, was that they then decided to rebuild their own domestic nuclear program and to move forward towards acquiring nuclear weapons. And in 2006, they detonated their first nuclear device. And today, they are a full nuclear weapons power. So that was the story then. And it seems to me that this proposal that the United States is making, or was alleged to be making, to Iran about the United States helping Iran with a civilian nuclear program and with sanctions relief, bore uncomfortable similarities to the proposal that the Clinton administration made to North Korea in the 1990s. If Iran were to agree to that deal, then as night follows day, all the same people or their lineal ideological descendants who, or rather ancestors, who back in the 1990s and early 2000s pushed back hard against the deal that the United States had concluded with North Korea, all of them would again assemble in the United States. They would say that the administration, the Trump administration, had made unacceptable concessions to Iran, that the deal with Iran was some sort of betrayal or capitulation by the United States. And even as Iran entered into presumably obligations to terminate in its entirety its nuclear enrichment program and maybe its entire civilian nuclear program, the deal that was done with the United States would unravel and the sanctions relief would never come, and the United States would fail to provide Iran with the assistance to develop its own civilian nuclear industry in the way that it had been promised. Well, my sense, I'm not 100% sure that that kind of deal was ever formally presented to the Iranians, but I'm going to suggest that probably something like it might have been, because over the last few hours, we've had a whole succession of very interesting exchanges between the Iranians and the Americans. And they begin with certain comments made by the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi. First of all, Donald Trump, in various comments that he made over the previous day, had suggested that a meeting between Iran and the United States, a resumption of the negotiations between Iran and the United States had been agreed, and that there would be a further meeting, perhaps in Oman next week. Arakshi has now said that Iran knows absolutely nothing about such a meeting, and it has not, in fact, agreed to such a meeting. He gave an interview late on Thursday night in which he said that Iran was safeguarding the rights of its people in the indirect nuclear talks with the United States before the Israeli aggression, and that the United States decided to employ another method afterwards, showed disappointment with the negotiations. And Arakshi then went on to say that the US military attacks on Iran were a betrayal of diplomacy. And he then went on to say this, and I'm taking this now from the Tasnim news agency, refuting US President Donald Trump's claim that nuclear talks with Iran will be held next week. The Iranian Foreign Minister said no agreement has been made on the restart of negotiations. There has not even been any talk of negotiations. The subject of negotiations is out of the question at present. And Arakshi then said that Iran does remain open to diplomacy, but the ground for future diplomacy needs to be prepared, which, by the way, I consider to be a very ominous statement, and I'll explain why later. So it looked to me as if the Iranians, maybe they'd seen these reports about the American offer, which was perhaps the offer that Steve Witkoff was going to bring with him to the meeting that Trump was talking about, which he wanted to happen with Iran next week. Maybe the Iranians saw all those news reports, or maybe some kind of message about this offer was communicated to them. Anyway, they'd said, no, we're not interested. You've attacked us. You've used the negotiations in a completely inappropriate way up to now. At the time when we were about to sit down and talk to you, you and your ally Israel attacked us, and we're not prepared to speak to you at this time. Anyway, that then resulted in the first of a succession of actually very interesting tweets, or rather posts on his Truth Social platform from President Trump of the United States. Firstly, he categorically denied, or appeared to deny, the reports that the United States had made this proposal for $30 billion to build non-military nuclear facilities to Iran. He said that no such offer had been made or even considered. Who in the fake news media is the sleazebag saying that President Trump wants to give Iran $30 billion to build non-military nuclear facilities? Never heard of this ridiculous idea. It's just another hoax put out by the fake news in order to demean. These people are sick. So that's Trump. Then a short time later, he followed up with another post on social media, which made an extraordinary, astonishing attack on Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader. He called him a liar. He said other extremely rude things about him. Well, I say extraordinary, maybe not so extraordinary. After all, Iran and the United States are in conflict, and some pretty terrible things have been said by each side about the other. But anyway, this was very much a personal attack on Khamenei. and saying that Khamenei was completely wrong and clearly lying when he was claiming that Iran had won a victory over Israel and the United States. I don't myself think that is the most interesting thing about this post. What I found much more interesting were comments like this. Well, specifically this comment. During the last few days, I was working on the possible removal of sanctions and other things which would have given a much better chance to Iran at a full, fast and complete recovery. The sanctions are biting, but no, instead I get hit with a statement of anger, hatred and disgust, and immediately dropped all work on sanctions relief and more. Iran has to get back into the world order flow or things will get worse for them, etc., etc. Now, Trump has just denied in an earlier Truth Social post that the offer, the $30 billion offer for help with civil nuclear facilities plus the sanctions relief has been made. The Iranians, as I said, give every impression of having rejected it. That seems to be what Arakshi is talking about. And then as far as I can see, Donald Trump is in effect confirming that he was indeed working on precisely the offer that he alleges that he had never even contemplated and the reporting of which was fake news. He says, I was working on the possible removal of sanctions and other things which would have given a much better chance to Iran at a full, fast and complete recovery. Well, maybe I'm reading too much into all of this, but that looks to me very, very much like essentially the same as those reports about the $30 billion offer for building up nuclear facilities and granting Iran sanctions relief if it gave up entirely its enrichment program. Could it be? I suspect it was the case that what really infuriated Trump was not Khamenei's comments, but more the fact that Iran has made it absolutely clear that after what has happened, all that has happened, it is no longer interested in negotiations, at least not at the present time, with the United States. That this meeting, which was going to happen next week, at which this offer perhaps would have been made, is not going to happen at all because the Iranians are not interested in holding this meeting at this particular time after all that has happened over the last 2 weeks. Anyway, that's how it looks to me. Now, Trump's words have provoked certain further comments from the Iranian Foreign Minister, Syed Arakshi. And Arakshi posted on X the following words: if President Trump is genuine about wanting a deal, he should put aside the disrespectful and unacceptable tone towards Iran's supreme leader, Grand Ayatollah Khamenei, and stop hurting his millions of heartfelt followers. The great and powerful Iranian people who showed the world that the Israeli regime had no choice but to run to daddy to avoid being flattened by our missiles, do not take kindly to threats and insults. If illusions lead to worse mistakes, Iran will not hesitate to unveil its real capabilities, which will certainly end any delusion about the power of Iran. Now, I think that there is here both advice and a warning the advice is that if you really do want to make a deal with your adversary and perhaps one day partner, then it is not a good idea to insult them in the way that Donald Trump has just insulted Ayatollah Khamenei. But consider the first, the further words that are actually used. If illusions lead to worse mistakes, Iran will not hesitate to unveil its real capabilities. And the words real capabilities, real, the first letter is capitalized, and C in the word capabilities is capitalized also. So those words are given additional emphasis. And it actually then goes on to say that these will certainly end, and the entire word end is capitalized, any delusion, and the first letter of the word delusion is capitalized, about the power, and the word power, the first letter of power, is capitalized, of Iran. Now, again, maybe I'm reading more into this than is there, but that does look to me like a hint that Iran is now seriously considering going nuclear, and if there is any more attacks on Iran in future, that could tip the whole internal debate that is taking place in Iran towards that direction. Now, I know that there are many people who continue to insist that Iran will never go nuclear. I have previously made clear my own skepticism about this view. I think that people are placing too much reliance on Khamenei's fatwa, assuming that a fatwa is like some kind of papal decree under the infallibility doctrine, which cannot be challenged or set aside or reversed. Khamenei's fatwa, anyway, and by the way, it's been reissued by Khamenei on several occasions, has always struck me as being slightly more qualified than many people suppose. But Khamenei is not a pope-like figure, and I think this is a thing that perhaps many people don't fully grasp. His fatwa is always open to challenge within Iran, from within the Islamic community of scholars. It is not, so far as I can see, universally accepted. And back in the autumn, I can clearly remember a whole succession of Iranian officials, of whom perhaps the most important was General Salami, the now assassinated head of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, making it fairly clear that as far as they were concerned, Khamenei's position was made no sense, and that Iran should indeed move forward to develop a nuclear weapons capability, because without it, there was no security from an attack by Israel or the United States. Now, here, I'm going to express my own view about Iran's stance. I've already said that I've always found it very difficult to understand why, if Iran really is committed to its policy of not moving forward towards a full nuclear weapons capability, it enriched uranium up to a level of 60%. There's been a common view expressed by many extremely intelligent people that what the Iranian people, I should stress, I have massive respect for, that what the Iranians were doing by enriching uranium to that level was strengthening their negotiating hand by putting some kind of pressure on the United States. It's always seemed to me that that made little sense. Ultimately, if you are going to enrich uranium up to 60%, but are never going to move towards acquiring a full nuclear weapons capability, you are engaging in a very dangerous bluff with the very real risk always that bluff is going to be called, which in a sense is what has happened over the last 2 weeks. I've never really understood this policy, and I am going to suggest that, in fact, rather than see it as a negotiation tactic, it's probably easier and better to understand it as the product of arguments and divisions within the Iranian leadership, resulting in an unhappy compromise whereby those who have advocated Iran acquiring a nuclear capability have been bought off with a commitment to enrich uranium up to a level of 60%, and those like President Pezeshkian and others who oppose Iran acquiring a nuclear weapons capability have in turn been reassured that that will never actually happen. Now, having been somebody who has seen governments function from the inside, I have to say that these kind of unhappy compromises are very common, particularly where there is no single coherent, united team moving and working together towards the same objective. And it strikes me that Iran does fall within that category of countries. It seems to me that the Khamenei himself is clearly the supreme leader and the ultimate policy maker. The structure of power in Iran effectively precludes him from taking direct day-to-day management of decisions, and he has to balance decisions between various lobby groups and factions. And besides, I also get the sense that his own inclinations to some extent point that way. And out of that kind of rather decentralized and diffused decision-making process, unsatisfactory compromises like the one I've described, and I have to say I've seen compromises like that which fully satisfy no one but manage to keep everybody just about on side. I've seen that happen on far too many occasions to count. Anyway, let's move on. I suspect that the Iranian political system is exactly the kind of system where you would expect a compromise like this to emerge out of a bitterly fought out debate between groups or factions, if you prefer, within the power structure, which cannot prevail against each other. Well, the events of the last 2 weeks, I think, have tilted the balance decisively, almost certainly, in favour of those who argue that after all that's happened, Iran really does need to move forward to acquire a proper nuclear weapons capability. Now, in order to get a sense of how this might work out, there is no better place than to go to a truly brilliant article written by Arnold Betron on his Substack, which its title is "The Key Lesson from Iran: Kim Jong-un was right about everything." And this article is a scintillatingly clear explanation of why, from this point onward, it would make sense. In fact, it would make compelling sense for Iran to decide to go nuclear. And I'm not going to read the whole article because, of course, it is on Substack. It's also quite long, but beyond that, it's obviously behind a paywall. But it contains comments like this. It says Iran was paradoxically in many ways too transparent, reasonable, and cooperative, accepting international monitoring that provided targeting intelligence, engaging in diplomatic processes that turned out to be elaborate traps, and honouring agreements that were unilaterally abandoned. And again, it's difficult to argue with any of that. And then Arnold Betron goes on to then set out the 4 key lessons, and he begins with lesson 1. You must have nuclear weapons, but you need to develop them outside any international monitoring. And he says, when North Korea decided it actually needed nuclear weapons in the early 2000s, it permanently withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, kicked out all international inspectors, and refused any monitoring. Then in 2006, it conducted its first nuclear test and became essentially untouchable. And then he describes what Iran did in contrast. Iran, by contrast, tried to do things the responsible way, maintaining IAEA monitoring agreements even while developing nuclear capabilities. Did that help them? Quite the contrary. Every major facility hit in the recent strikes was precisely known to attackers because of ongoing IAEA inspections. Iran's transparency didn't earn protection. It provided a targeting manual. And that's absolutely correct. And in fact, no less a person than the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, has again made precisely that very same point. He has made this comment. The Parliament of Iran has voted for a halt to collaboration with the IAEA until the safety and security of our nuclear activities can be guaranteed. Now notice those words again. The safety and security of our nuclear activities can be guaranteed. And then he goes on to say this. This is a direct result of Rafael Grossi's regrettable role in obfuscating the fact that the agency, a full decade ago, already closed all past issues. This is the questions of what Iran had been doing with its nuclear program of the 1990s, which I have discussed in many places and many times, and I'm not going to return to here. The fact being that Iran did have a nuclear program, which it did try to keep secret in the 1990s, but it owned up to it completely in the early 2000s, and previously the IAEA accepted that this was a historic program that had no relevance to the situation of today. And then Araghchi goes on to say, through this malign action, this is by bringing up the whole topic of what Iran was doing 20 years ago, resurrecting that now dead issue, through this malign action, Grossi directly facilitated the adoption of a politically motivated resolution against Iran by the IAEA Board of Governors, as well as the unlawful Israeli and U.S. bombings of Iranian nuclear sites. He is absolutely right about this. The Russian government has said the same in forthright terms. And then Araghchi goes on to say, in an astounding betrayal of his duties, Rafael Grossi has additionally failed to explicitly condemn such blatant violations of IAEA safeguards and its statutes. And he means there, what he's referring to there, is the Israeli and American attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities, which were being inspected and monitored by the IAEA itself, and were covered by its safeguards and its statute, and which therefore should have been protected from an attack. And then Abbas Araghchi goes on to say, the IAEA and its Director General are fully responsible for this sordid state of affairs. Rafael Grossi's insistence on visiting the bomb sites under the pretext of safeguards is meaningless and possibly even malign in its intent. Iran reserves the right to take any steps in its defense of its interests, its people, and its sovereignty. Again, notice the word any steps in defense of its interests, people, and sovereignty. Anyway, let's just move on and go back now to what Arnold Betron has said. He then makes the same point about Grossi's behavior that I have made on many programs, that Alex Christoforou has made in a absolutely excoriating program that he did about Grossi's behavior on his channel, and which Alex and I have also made on the Duran, and which of course have also been made by many people. This is what Arnold Betron says. Worse still, the day before Israel strikes began, the IAEA found Iran non-compliant with its nuclear obligations for the first time in 20 years, essentially rewarding Iran for its decades-long collaboration with the agency by giving Israel diplomatic cover for the attack. The lesson is not only stark, not only did Israel and U.S. behavior validate the crucial importance of developing nuclear weapons, but it also proved that maintaining any cooperation or transparency while developing them is suicidal. It just helps your enemy target you more effectively. And then Arnold Betron says that diplomacy is worse than useless. He says that Iran got trapped into a diplomatic process, which is revealed to be a ruse, using fake negotiations to buy time for a joint US-Israeli attack, whilst justifying that attack as Iran's failure to accept purposefully unacceptable conditions. Now, I've already expressed my own view here, that I'm not sure that it was quite as Machiavellian as many people, including Arnold Betron, think. But then again, it doesn't really matter, because it's not what someone like I think about this. It's about the effect on Iran. They were negotiating with all appearance of good faith, and instead they were attacked whilst those negotiations were underway. And then lesson 3, and again Arnold Betron says, reject all Western technology and build completely indigenous systems. And he makes the point that North Korea is essentially cyber-proof because it uses purely indigenous systems. Russia and China are becoming the same. China probably already is. Russia largely is. I've mentioned in the past how back in 2017, the Washington Post spoke about how the United States had inserted cyber bombs into Russia's infrastructure, and how, despite all of that, after the start of the special military operation, no evidence ever came to light of those cyber bombs being operated effectively by the United States, which to my mind confirms that the Russians took effective countermeasures, and which they have almost certainly developed as they have steadily replaced Western technology within their infrastructure with Russian technology. Anyway, Arnold Betron makes the point that Iran didn't do this, so that the result was that the Iranians found that they not only had the Israelis and the Americans inside their systems, but able to conduct cyber attacks and make, by the way, totally unacceptable threats to Iranian generals via their cell phones, threatening those generals not just with personal assassination, but with actions against their families. Now, when I heard about this, I found that so disturbing that those sort of threats were made, that I have to say I didn't want to believe that those reports were true. I wanted to believe that they might have been the kind of fake news that is now always circulating, but is so often circulating. But it seems that one of the conversations, the famous leaked conversation, the famous leaked recording of threats being made directly to an Iranian general of that kind that has circulated, has actually been validated by the Washington Post. That is apparently what I have heard. And that it might have been leaked by Mossad itself as a way of basically making it clear that this is what the Israelis are prepared to do. I have to say, this is so disturbing, it is so terrible, that again, the extent to which this kind of behavior is not only tolerated by support, but also supported by Western governments, on top of everything else that Israel has been doing in the last 3 years in Gaza and elsewhere. I mean, it just, as I said, leaves me speechless. But anyway, I will move on. And then Arnold Betron says that the Iranians and others need to understand that preemptive strikes and targeted assassinations of civilians are now legitimate. I have already spoken about this, and I'm not going to repeat this again. So, Arnold Betron's conclusion is that the wisest course for Iran to follow is to follow the example of its friend and ally, North Korea, to develop independently its own nuclear weapons capability, to cease all further contacts with the IAEA, to engage in no diplomatic negotiations with the United States and its allies at all, and to cyberproof its infrastructure by moving wholesale away from Western technology, either developing its own, as North Korea apparently did, or perhaps importing that technology from countries like China and perhaps North Korea and Russia, which is not susceptible to the same kind of infiltration as the Western infrastructure that Iran has been using, as that infrastructure has been. So, in other words, an uncompromising attitude from Iran. Now let's just go back to Araghchi's various words. And first of all, consider His first words: Iran, it's too early for Iran to negotiate with the United States. Iran needs to prepare the ground for negotiations. Prepare the ground in what way? Perhaps by becoming a nuclear weapons power. He talks about Iran not hesitating to unveil its real capabilities, which will end any delusion about the power of Iran. Is that perhaps a hint that Iran is now seriously contemplating going nuclear? And coming back to his choice, to his words about what Iran might decide to do in the future, that Iran reserves the right to take any steps in defense of its interests, its people, and its sovereignty. Any steps. That does not exclude acquiring nuclear weapons. Presumably, if you wanted to say any steps, say the one step that Iran is endlessly accused of seeking, acquiring nuclear weapons, Arakshi could have said that. But note that he doesn't. He speaks about any steps in defense of its interests, its people, and its sovereignty. And he makes absolutely clear that the relationship between Iran and the IAEA is now dead. Now, I have expressed in my own programs, in many programs, my own view, my own belief that I would far rather that Iran did not acquire nuclear weapons. I worry that if Iran did acquire nuclear weapons, other countries would follow. I've mentioned Saudi Arabia. I've mentioned Turkey. An article, by the way, has appeared in Unheard, the British magazine, by, of all people, Fiona Hill, a person who I have no time for at all. But she also says that if Iran goes nuclear, Turkey might be one of the countries that would follow suit. Anyway, I don't want to see that. I absolutely do not want to see that happen at all. I also think that if Iran is interested or thinking of going nuclear, then, as I said, it would immensely heighten tensions in the Middle East. But anyway, to continue, I've said that Iran should instead work more closely with its Eurasian friends, with Russia and China, to build up its security systems, its defense systems. It should accept the Russian offer of a defense agreement and help with its air defense systems. It should accept whatever assistance China is willing to offer it. Incidentally, on this topic, there's been, I notice, a sustained attempt in parts of the Western media, and it's been picked up also by some sections of the independent media as well, to suggest that Iran is somehow becoming disillusioned in its relationship with Russia, and that it might be distancing itself from Russia in some way. I've also seen claims that Iran is now tilting more towards China than Russia. Simplicius the Thinker has devoted a huge amount of his latest Substack post to trying to refute these claims. I'm going to say straight away, unlike most commentators, I spent a great deal of time analysing, reading and following what the Iranian media are actually saying and what Iranian officials are actually saying. And I do not get the slightest hint from Iranian publications that there is any disillusion or resentment or distancing by Iran from Russia whatsoever. This is entirely a phantom story, which someone has obviously been busy concocting in the West, just to say. So anyway, the point is, I've made the point that, Iran's best interests, the best interests of the region, are to be found in Iran not seeking to acquire nuclear weapons, but instead moving forward with BRICS engagement, developing its position in the BRICS, accepting defense agreements with Russia, obtaining weapon systems from Russia and China, and doing all of those things. And I still think that. But I have to also say, even as I think that, and even as I advocate for it, I can't help but think that that argument in terms of the internal debate that may be happening in Iran is now being lost. All the points I have been making must seem very weak to some people in Iran in light of the attacks that have just been made against Iran over the last 2 weeks. Ultimately, what I am advocating is that Iran should look to other countries, China and Russia, for its own security. I can't help but think that within Iran, the more persuasive arguments are going to be made, or sound, the arguments that sound most persuasive are going to be those made by those within Iran who argue that Iran should ensure its own security by developing its own weapons, and that must mean nuclear weapons at this time. Notice Araghchi's repeated reference to Iran's sovereignty, its sovereign position. And that again makes me think that Iran is leaning towards pursuing an independent course, not placing excessive dependence on its presumed allies, but forging its own path. Well, I'm going to make a prediction that if it does happen, if the worst comes true, if at some point over the next few months or year, whenever, Iran does publicly go nuclear, it acquires a nuclear weapons capability, all of those people who have brought us to this point, in the United States, in Israel, in Europe, all of them who have obstructed and sabotaged every single attempt to achieve a workable solution of this crisis with Iran, are going to come out and say that they have been vindicated, that this was the Iranian objective all along. The facts, the history might say the diametric opposite, but that is the way in which these people behave, and that is what I expect. In fact, I don't expect, I am sure that they are going to do. I can already see the articles being written, that all the articles that will claim that all attempts to engage with Iran were dangerous and naive. They've simply emboldened Iran in some way to do the thing which it has done, and that the right and proper thing is not to engage in diplomacy with adversaries, but instead to attack them, and to attack them in the most forceful possible way imaginable in order to prevent them acquiring the capabilities that Iran will have acquired. Anyway, that's for the future. As to whether or not Iran has made that final decision, I still think that, as I said, this is still being discussed in Iran as I am speaking. I don't know. I think that Araghchi's words now are pointing towards Iran making that decision. But as to the response to it, of all of those who have brought us to this point, to that point of crisis, if we ever reach it, as to that, I'm sorry to say, I have no doubt at all. The inability of those people to learn any lessons, to understand their own responsibility for the crises that they are creating is limitless, and the one thing I am confident about is that it will never change. Anyway, since I've been talking a lot about Arnold Betron, I'm going to briefly touch on another article that he's also written, which I read about a week ago, which I found quite interesting, which is the one in which he talks about China and the United States, and he refers to another scholar who says that the United States, far from standing up to China in the Indo-Pacific region, is in fact in some way withdrawing from the Indo-Pacific region and is in effect ceding control of it, or at least some kind of superior position in it to China. Now, I'm going to say this. I don't think that any such decision has been made in the United States at all. I think that in the United States, the leadership there, the political leadership, the military leadership, remain implacably hostile to China, and they still want and intend to have some kind of great reckoning with China in order to beat China back, to prevent it ever superseding the United States, as they fear, as the world's most powerful country. What I think has happened is not that there's been any decision to give up on the confrontation with China. I think instead what has happened is that the United States has been conducting an overcomplicated geopolitical strategy against China. At some point back in Obama's time, when the pivot to Asia was first being talked about, all of the various lobby groups and factions in the U.S. intelligence community and the regime change community came together and said, no, we can't pull back from the Middle East, from the Caucasus, from Europe, from Russia, from Ukraine, from any of these places. We must all recommit ourselves with extra vigor to pursuing all our plans in these places, because what we need to do is to cause them all to fall as dominoes. First Russia, or then Iran, or first Iran, and then Russia, and then we need to cut off China from oil from the Middle East, and all of those things. As I said, a very complicated strategy cobbled together to reconcile all the various vested interests in Washington that are all insisting on continuing to do their own things in various places in the world. And it's all been woven together and presented as some kind of grand strategy, ultimately, to isolate and defeat China. And that brings me back to that famous Rand Corporation report about overextending Russia by starting all kinds of problems around Russia's periphery. It seems to me that what has actually happened is that far from Russia becoming overextended, it is the United States that is becoming overextended in Europe, the Middle East, the Caucasus, Central Asia, Africa, wherever you like. And of course, Russia, far from being overextended, has become more powerful, and China has become much more powerful still. One should not look for more coherence in American policy than there really is. American policy towards Russia is consistently hostile, but in the end, incoherent and confused. American policy towards China is consistently hostile, but incoherent and confused. And it is reckless and dangerous in relation to both. But anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. It's an interesting debate, which perhaps I can talk about in more detail at some other time. Now, there is the other conflict, the one in Ukraine, that I also do need to talk about. And yesterday, President Putin of Russia, who's attending a meeting of the Eurasian Economic Union in Minsk, gave another brief, impromptu press conference with Russian journalists. Some of the questions were clearly planted. Now, they were nonetheless quite interesting. First of all, he ridiculed the whole 5% of GDP program that the European countries have committed themselves to at the NATO summit, which has just taken place. The Russians, by the way, have been utterly scathing about this. One Russian official pointed out its complete absurdity. He said this, and it's absolutely irrefutable. If the Europeans really believe that Russia is about to attack them, why are they saying that they will increase their defense spending to 5% of GDP in 2035? What do they imagine that this allegedly aggressive Russia is going to do over the next 10 years? I mean, it's an obvious point, but as I said, the Russians have been absolutely, they've been enjoying themselves, ridiculing this whole NATO meeting, and Putin basically joined in the fun over the course of this press conference. I'm not going to discuss in detail what he said, but he made a number of points. He said that Russia spends 6.3% of its budget, of its GDP on defense at the present time in order to conduct the special military operation. Interestingly, he said that starting from next year, that proportion is likely to fall and to continue to fall. And that leads me to think that Putin expects that the special military operation will be over next year. In other words, that Russia will have won the conflict in Ukraine next year. It's an interesting point, and one that I will explore in more detail in a future program. But he also made the point that at the time of the Korean War in the early 1950s, the United States was spending 14% of its GDP on defense. At the time of the Vietnam War in the 1960s, the United States was spending 10% of its GDP on defense. What Russia is spending today, 6.3%, is significantly more modest than what the United States spent in those two earlier wars. And anyway, that was quite interesting. He also said that the idea that there is a threat to Europe from Russia is preposterous, even as the Europeans are planning to increase defense spending the Russians are actually thinking about reducing their defense spending. But he also made it quite clear that the Russians don't take in any way seriously any threat from NATO or Europe at all. By now, clearly, he feels that the Russian armed forces have evolved to the point where they can meet any threat, real or potential, that the NATO powers can bring against Russia. He also spoke about the ongoing negotiation process with Ukraine. He claimed that Medinsky and Umerov, the two chief negotiators, are in regular contact with each other. He again floated the possibility that there might be another meeting in Istanbul. There's no sign of such a meeting taking place at all. None, actually. He admitted that the gulf between the negotiating positions of the Ukrainians and the Russians remains enormous. He still seemed to think that there was some point in continuing this negotiation process. I am completely unable to see what it is. But anyway, that was what Putin said. Clearly, the Russians have taken the view that it suits their interests to keep the appearance of a negotiation process going, even though my own view is that privately they have given up on it, as I discussed in recent programs. But it is what Putin said about Donald Trump that has attracted more attention. And I'm going to read his comments, which have appeared on the Kremlin. The Kremlin has provided a official translation and transcript. And I'm going to say straight away that what this is all about, what it is clearly all about, is a response to further urgent requests coming from Erdogan and Trump for a summit meeting between Putin and Trump to take place in Turkey. I said in my program yesterday that it seemed to me that the Russians were not at all keen on that idea at this time. And, well, this is what Putin said. And this was the question. And it was made by a journalist from Kommersant. I think this is a planted question. Do you not consider it timely to arrange a personal meeting with Donald Trump? From an external perspective, one might observe a degree of mutual distancing, so to speak, while telephone communication serves its purpose. Face-to-face engagement, as the saying goes, carries distinct significance. What are your thoughts? And then Putin gave a very interesting and rather long answer. I hold the incumbent president of the United States in the highest regard. His path to returning to power and to the White House has been exceptionally arduous, complex and hazardous, a fact of which we are all cognizant, particularly given the assassination attempts he has survived, indeed multiple attempts on his life. He is a courageous man, that is evident. What does any of that have to do with the question? Anyway, let's move on. We highly value both his domestic policies and his endeavours regarding the Middle East situation, as well as his efforts towards resolving the Ukrainian crisis. I have previously articulated this position and wish to reaffirm it publicly. I am convinced that President Trump is generally committed to resolving the issue on the Ukrainian track. Recently, I observed that the matter has proved more intricate than external appearances suggested. This is indeed the case. Such complexity is unsurprising. There exists a substantial difference between distant observation and direct engagement with the issue. The same is true of the Middle East crisis. Although he may have greater experience there, having been more deeply involved in Middle Eastern affairs, complexities persist there as well. Real life is always more complex than any notion of it. I have consistently maintained openness to dialogue and meetings. I am aware President Trump has similarly referenced potential discussions. Like him, I contend such encounters require meticulous preparation and must yield tangible new milestones in cooperation. Overall, thanks to President Trump, Russian-American relations are demonstrating initial stabilization, at least to some extent. Not all issues in diplomatic relations have been resolved, but the first steps have been taken and we are moving forward. We have established operational contacts between respective agencies, notably between the Department of State and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, alongside coordination between our security services, which is also very important. For example, counterterrorism remains a priority for us in any circumstances, as do interactions along with certain other operational collaborations. We have good prospects for economic cooperation. We are aware that American businesses are demonstrating interest, showing intent, and sending signals about their desire to return to our market. We can only welcome this. However, all such developments require consistent preparation. That said, overall, such a meeting remains entirely possible and we would be pleased to arrange it. Thank you very much. All the best. Now, that is a polite no. That is Putin saying, no, this is not the moment for a summit meeting between myself and Donald Trump. If you go back to and go through what he said carefully, you will find that there is one sentence in this melange of words that he has poured out, which sets out his actual position. I contend such encounters require meticulous preparation and must yield tangible new milestones in cooperation. So, meticulous preparation, tangible new milestones in cooperation. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be as if that is the situation at all. So Putin has, in very polite, very friendly words, basically said no. It reminds me very much of what happened back on the 18th of March when Trump telephoned Putin and asked Putin to agree to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. And Putin said, I absolutely am in favor of an unconditional ceasefire for 30 days. And then he went on to say, but there are, unfortunately, all of these nuances, all of these various issues that need to be sorted out as well before we can even think of coming to this point, which, as I pointed out then, as we pointed out on the Duran, was again a polite way of Putin to say no. And that is exactly what he has done again. He said no to a summit meeting with Trump. But he's done it in a very diplomatic way without stooping to the frankly vomit-inducing levels of sycophancy that we saw at the NATO summit meeting. And Trump apparently appreciated these words of Putin, these diplomatically couched words that Putin has used. Now, speaking of more substantive things, I said in recent programs that the Russians are now making it increasingly clear that they not only no longer support Ukraine's entry into the EU, but they are now opposing it, and that they are treating it as a red line, and that, in fact, it's increasingly looking as if there's actually been a decision by the Kremlin to make it a red line. Medvedev's and Lavrov's comments, in my opinion, clearly pointed in that direction. But now we've had further statements from other Russian officials saying the same thing. And we've had comments from Vladislav Maslenikov, director of the European Problems Department at the Russian Foreign Ministry. In other words, a very senior official at the Russian Foreign Ministry, and the one who is concerned with Russia's relations with Europe. And he says this. He's reported to have said this: "I see no reason why we should support the idea of Ukraine joining the European Union, particularly because the EU is moving towards active militarization, virtually setting the task of constantly opposing us, including in terms of resolving the Ukrainian crisis. One should not forget here that the European Union has an article in the Treaty of Lisbon which is no less significant than Article 5 of the Washington Treaty on collective defense in NATO. This is why Ukraine's accession to the EU does not meet our interests." And Maslenikov said that, by the way, in an interview with the Russian newspaper Izvestia. So it's become clear to me that a decision has been made by the highest level, at the highest level, by Russia's leadership, by the one that the foreign ministry is now communicating, that Russia no longer supports, in fact, strongly opposes Ukraine's entry into the European Union. The Russians have dropped the pretense that the European Union is anything other than a geopolitical project. And for that reason, the Russians now say that they not only no longer support Ukraine entering the European Union, they actively oppose such a thing. Now, again, there is little time in this program to provide a rundown of the military situation in Ukraine. All I would say is that, again, the Russians appear to be advancing on every part of the front lines. There's been more reports of further Russian advances, for example, in the Volchansk area, in Kharkiv region, and of significant Russian advances in Zaporozhye and southwestern Donbass. I discussed in a recent program how it seems that the Russians are in the process of capturing the strategically important village of Malaya Tokmachka, which would presumably open the way for a Russian attack and ultimate capture of the neighboring town of Orekhov in Zaporozhye region. But perhaps even more important is that there are reports that Russian troops have now entered Kupiansk and that they may be in the process of storming Kupiansk. Now, this information comes from our old friend, Andrei Marochko, and he was talking to TASS. He says, regarding the settlement of Kupiansk, our troops are already working in the town, according to some reports. In the settlement itself, a number of small groups are operating, which are entering Kupiansk and identifying the enemy's firing points. The so-called reconnaissance in force is underway. Our servicemen have carried out a number of raids deep into the enemy's defense in Kupiansk itself. So he says that this is according to some reports, but then he seems to know a great deal more about it, which suggests that it may very well be true. And there are reports that the Ukrainians have blown up a bridge near Kupiansk in order to disrupt Russian logistics, which looks to me like providing some possible corroboration that what Marochko is saying is true, and that there is indeed now an entry of Russian troops into Kupiansk, and that the Russians are now finally storming Kupiansk. Now, this has been a prolonged affair. The Russians came close to Kupiansk, I remember, in the early autumn of 2023, whilst Ukraine's offensive in Zaporozhye was still underway. They've steadily advanced around Kupiansk. They captured some months ago the village of Sinkovka, close to Kupiansk. They've cleared all the territory around Kupiansk, east of the Oskol River, though the Ukrainians still have some positions there. They then crossed the Oskol River. They've gradually widened their bridgehead. They've established more and more territory. Recently, reports began to appear that they'd captured certain villages and communities close to Kupiansk itself. But they made a very, very protracted thing of this. And up to now, they've not conducted what looks like an organised assault. I suspect, again, that their priority has been to attract Ukrainian troops to Kupiansk, to try to get them to defend Kupiansk itself and to burn through Ukrainian reserves assigned to defend Kupiansk. The Russian objective always being the destruction of Ukraine's armies rather than the capture of towns and cities, something that Alex and I discussed in a program we did on the Duran shortly after the special military operation began. But anyway, it looks as if this long, drawn-out game that the Russians have been playing with Kupiansk might finally be coming to an end. And we're getting the first reports, therefore, from Marochka, who is well informed, that the first steps to storm and capture Kupiansk are now underway. Kupiansk is not a big place. It's not as defendable as, say, Chasiv Yar has been. And I get the sense that not only are the Ukrainian supply routes into Kupiansk far more threatened, but the place is nowhere near as defendable as Chasiv Yar proved to be. So if the Russians are indeed inside Kupiansk and are starting the storming of that town, then maybe this will be a relatively short affair. Anyway, we shall see. This is where I end today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.